Hello and welcome back to Davenant Discussions. My name is Ben Miller and I'm here today with Dr. Brad Littlejohn, the president of the Davenant Trust and author of a dissertation on the life and thinking of Richard Hooker. And we want to continue our history of the English Reformation really here by talking about Richard Hooker in particular, a theologian under the reign of Queen Elizabeth, whose story you began to explore a little bit in a previous video. Tell us who Richard Hooker was, some of the big ideas he brought in his writings, and a little bit about why that matters for us today.
Yeah, Richard Hooker, his life really overlaps almost completely with that of Queen Elizabeth. He's born in or with Queen Elizabeth's reign, I should say. He's born in 1554, just a few years before she comes to the throne, and he dies in 1600, just shortly before the end of her reign. He's very much formed in the milieu of this church that is, as I've said in the previous video, is fully Protestant in doctrine and Reformed in doctrine, to the extent that as Reformed and Lutheran are starting to sort themselves out, and yet in practice, in outward appearance, has a lot of continuity with the medieval church, and so this becomes an increasingly contentious issue during his life, particularly. As he's coming to a public career in preaching and teaching. Now, that career, it's quite interesting. He studied at Oxford. His instructors at Oxford were largely of broadly Puritan sympathies, as we understand that. They were really focused on continuing to reform the Church of England and doing more to bring it in line with the best Reformed churches abroad. That was kind of their catchphrase. But as the 1580s went on, he became increasingly concerned about the militancy that a lot of the Puritan movement was taking. And it was one of these things where both sides were exacerbating it. The church leaders were saying the best way to deal with these calls of reform is just to shut it down entirely, and make everyone sign on the dotted line. The church as it stands is fine. It doesn't need any further reform. And if you're not willing to do that, then you lose your position, which, of course, is not the sort of environment that's very conducive to facilitating fruitful dialogue. So the Puritans, for their part, tend to take a more radical line, saying not merely, there's some things here that really probably could be better, but, this is really not even, this church doesn't match up to the standard of what God says a church should be to really be a true church. Maybe this isn't a true church. Maybe we need to restructure it from the top down, get rid of the bishops. And some are they're not really advocating, but they're being read as advocating for some kind of popular revolution to reform the church. So Hooker is increasingly concerned about this, and his own kind of formative experience is his first real position is master of the Temple Church in London. It's a very influential church. It's where the basically all the law school of England was located at the Temple. And however, his assistant, so he's the main preacher. His assistant is Walter Travers, one of the leaders of the Puritan movement, and actually his brother-in-law. So, there are many stories in history of brothers-in-law not getting along. So something's nothing new under the sun. So there's a famous episode where he preaches a sermon in the morning on justification. He thinks he's just articulating the Protestant doctrine of justification, and Walter Travers kind of singles out a line where he thinks he's not being hard enough on the Catholics. So he's in charge of the afternoon sermon. So he gets up and gives an afternoon sermon about why Hooker was wrong. So then Hooker prepares his sermon for the next week, defending himself, and then Travers takes notes and delivers the afternoon sermon about why that one's wrong. So there's a preaching war that goes on for a few weeks here, and people all around London are sort of flocking to watch this preaching war until the authorities had Travers removed for being insubordinate. And many scholars think this episode kind of made Hooker say, "Well, I think I was just giving straight up Protestant doctrine," but he had this mindset of maybe because Hooker was supportive of the established church government that he wasn't fully Orthodox, he wasn't Reformed enough. So Hooker wants to explore what is that mindset that kind of gets this obsession about. We are the truly Reformed and other people are not. They're not zealous enough. They're not Reformed enough unless they are on board with our full agenda. So he writes what becomes one of the great great classics of English theological literature, the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, and which is not exactly the sexiest title, but really it's a whole theory, it's a whole Christian theory of law and of ecclesiology and of the role. Here's what it is. It's asking the question, I think the timeless question, given that the Bible is our ultimate authority,
Yeah.
and given that we have many other authorities in our lives, we have authorities in church, we have authorities in state, we have teachers, we have parents, etc. How do these different levels of authority intersect?
Yes.
And how the Bible being our highest authority does not mean the Bible is our only authority, to the sense that it's just me and my Bible and I ignore what everyone else tells me. I am supposed to honor these other authorities. And here's the key thing, right? Honoring authority, really, it's easy to honor authority when you agree with the authority. Oh, no, the authority said this, but I already thought that anyway. So that's not really when the rubber when the rubber meets the road is when I disagree with the authority and I'm still supposed to obey. Well, what if I disagree with the authority because I think that what they're commanding me is unbiblical? Well, the Bible is my highest authority. How do we adjudicate that kind of clash of loyalties? And what Hooker's wrestling with is obviously there's a point at which you say, Bible's my authority, I have to ignore that unbiblical command. But I also have to say, Bible's my authority, but I'm just me, and this is a wise leader telling me to do this, and it seems unbiblical to me, but I may just be being stubborn. And maybe I need to suspend judgment for now and accept what my God-given authorities are telling me to do. And so how do we navigate that clash of authorities? That's really what Hooker's wrestling with, and it's a question that's at the heart of the Reformation. I mean,
Yes.
Luther is opposing papal authority on the basis of his conscience's requirement to obey the authority of Scripture. But how do you do that without pulling the rug out from under every kind of human authority that God's put in its place?
So given the timelessness of this problem, what would you say is one area where we can really learn specifically from Hooker in our modern wrestlings with identical sorts of issues?
Well, I think a key thing here is the fundamental issue that Hooker's opposing is something that's just become very dominant in American evangelicalism, and this historical reasons, because the Puritans that Hooker was dealing with, by and large, immigrated to America, and kind of their ethos is our ethos, and that is this idea that if there's something important for the Christian life, then the Bible must speak directly to it. And if the Bible doesn't seem to speak to it, that must just mean you're not looking hard enough, right?
Right.
And so you got to find the proof text. And once you do that, you've raised the stakes really, really high, so that if you disagree with me on this, that's because you don't believe the Bible. That's because you're not being faithful to Scripture.
The Reformation stands or falls here.
Yeah, and then you do that, and you're going to just start splitting, which is what American churches have done. And so Hooker says, it doesn't necessarily work that way. Sometimes we're called to exercise critical moral judgment in an area where Scripture has not given us direct guidance, and that reduces the stakes a little bit. This is an area in which we might have room to disagree, have room to live with a non-ideal state of affairs for a while. And I think that is a lesson that American Protestantism, with its history of sectarianism, urgently needs to recover.
Very good and helpful. Thank you very much.